when we look at the UAP phenomenon, we may not be dealing with a threat at all. We just may be dealing with a symptom of the universe that is manifesting in the appearance or the form of UFOs or UAP at this time. Now, I'm not saying that that's exclusively what UAP are. Clearly, non-human intelligences, under the law exist, and there may be an infinite variety of them. They themselves may have hacked into this model, this system of ours, from outside of it, or they could be a part of it within the model alongside us. To look on UAP, UFOs exclusively as a threat, I think is a mistake. We need to, as I say, we need to broaden that out.
Most people who end up arguing that reality might be a participatory information system don't arrive there from Jane's Defense Weekly, but today's guest did. For the better part of 2 decades, Nick Cook was the aviation editor of the world's most authoritative defense journal. He was the man who broke stories on Russian secret weapons, classified rescue operations, and the black projects the United States insisted did not exist. He won 4 Aerospace Journalist of the Year awards, wrote The Hunt for Zero Point, the book that took the question of anti-gravity propulsion out of the conspiracy aisle and put it on the desks of serious people inside the defense establishment. And then a personal experience inside his own family came along that didn't fit the model. And the journalist trained to chase classified hardware found himself chasing something far stranger. A few weeks ago, he opened the doors of the Exo Institute in London, an organization built around the idea that the outliers our science has been ignoring may be telling us we've had the universe wrong. Nick Cook, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm listening to your introduction. It always struck me then that, the things that don't make sense in your career at the time, that just seem like a bunch of sort of very separate episodes in one's life actually come together to sort of signify a meaningful pattern. So it was quite instructive to hear that said about my career, because suddenly it all kind of seemed to make sense to me in a way that it didn't necessarily at the time.
Yeah, I hear that. It reminds me almost of that Steve Jobs speech where he's saying that as you're going through life, you pick up skills that don't make sense at the time. But in hindsight, you look back and you're like, wow, I really was given everything I needed to be the person that I am today doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I would see 100% eye to eye with Steve Jobs on that, certainly as it applies to my own career. So yeah, miracles happen.
Okay, let's jump in. So before we get anywhere near the strange stuff, I want to start kind of at the beginning so people get a sense of who you are and why what you have to say, for me at least, is held with so much gravitas. 18 years at Jane's Defense Weekly isn't something you just kind of fall into. And the institution exists because intelligence services, defense ministries, aerospace, workers need somewhere they can go that they can trust to take complicated information seriously. So before we get to everything that no doubt everyone listening and you and I are eager to talk about, what was the instinct that pulled you into that world of defense reporting?
Well, that was extraordinarily simple because I left university with a degree in Arabic and Islamic studies, as it happened, which was then a complete dead end. There was nowhere that, much as I was interested in that world, there was nowhere that I could see that taking me professionally, not at the time. So I had to sort of pivot to what I had always found myself interested in. And what I had always found myself interested in was technology, engineering, and specifically aerospace. I'd always been really interested in aviation. So obviously, without an engineering degree, going into the business itself didn't make any kind of sense. I'm quite a sort of, in many ways, I'm quite a linear thinker. So I thought, oh, well, I'm stuck, I'll never be able to enter that profession. And then my dad actually pointed out to me that maybe I could write about it, which was sort of like an enormous breakthrough in my sort of worldview, because at that point, I knew that was what I wanted to do. And after that, even though it took me about a year and a half, I guess, to actually opened doors sufficiently to get a job offer. But after that moment, I knew that that's what I was going to be. And it was a fantastically lucky break. I mean, I often think back, what would I have done if I had not had that break? Because for those 18 years, actually, there were 3.5 years before that when I was with another aerospace and defense publication called Interavia, which was a very serious business publication headquartered in Switzerland. And I moved from Interavia and International Defense Review to Jane's Defense Weekly in 1986. But, that breakthrough was just huge for me. And I seriously wonder what I would have ended up doing if I hadn't had that break.
Yeah, absolutely. Hearing you say that you moved in 1986, and revering your work as I do, it's kind of a moment where my brain's breaking a little bit. But I was born in 1985. So you've literally been doing this since I was born, literally.
Yeah. Well, so I have. Heavens, that's a scary thought for me too.
Well, you look very young and spry. You're clearly feeding your soul with something good. The Arabic and Islamic studies is really interesting. Not the usual on-ramp to, I guess, aerospace journalism, but it does strike me, learning a language is one of the few things that genuinely forces you to inhabit another way of seeing the world. Do you think that early training and immersing yourself in a culture not your own, different cosmology and metaphysics and relationships to the unseen, do you think that prepared you for a life of trying to make sense of other intelligences?
I've never been asked that question before, but absolutely it does. So just to backtrack a little bit, my parents, my mum and my stepfather was a diplomat, and he ended up getting posted in my mid-teens to Cairo. And I completely fell in love with the place. It was hard to believe now, but at a time when the Middle East seemed safe, or at least a lot of the Middle East seemed safe. My parents, lots of parents in those days would let their kids out to play in the street or, in the locality, let them go off on bike rides or whatever. My parents allowed me to go into the deep streets and back streets of Cairo to explore as a 15 and 16-year-old, 14, 15-year-old. And I never had any sense in that time that I was unsafe. It just never occurred to me. It never felt unsafe, but it opened my eyes, implicit in your question, to worlds that I could never have conceived of had I just lived my sort of ordinary provincial life back in the UK. So yeah, it completely opened my eyes to curiosities, sort of enigmas, other ways of thinking, different civilizations. And I think, yes, in retrospect, it paved the way to some of the things that I'm doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. When you said about it, it made me think of, it was Arrival, where the movie where the aliens come down and Amy Adams' character starts thinking in time differently because she's thinking in a different language. And I think it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where you start literally seeing the world differently, like your brain literally processes it differently. So that's really interesting to me that you picked up that puzzle piece along the way. Very synchronous.
Well, and thanks for sort of cementing it into place, because I'd not really given that too much thought before.
There's a story I love about how all this kind of started for you. That, if I'm not mistaken, someone handed you a magazine clipping where executives from Lockheed, Boeing, they're talking about gravity control, the way engineers today talk about things like battery efficiency. It's very just straight-faced, kind of boring, talking about the efficiencies of batteries just isn't that interesting. And seeing scientists talk about anti-gravity or gravity repulsion in that way must have been fascinating. But what was the thing about that clipping that really got you?
Well, that really was the sort of inception point, inciting moment of the Hunt for Zero Point. Until that time, I'd been working, that article landed on my desk at Jane's. It was in the early mid-90s. And it followed a period in my career at Jane's Defense Weekly when I'd been deeply immersed in investigating classified aerospace programs, particularly in the US. So it was a period, late 80s, early 90s, was a period of massive black world expansion in the US defense industrial base. In other words, doing lots of secret things that, budgetary items that never surfaced in the open budgetary literature, things like stealth, things like hypersonic programs. My colleague and I, Bill Sweetman, completely immersed ourselves in those programs. We wanted to find out what was going on, and particularly because there was a culture around them that said, you can lie to protect the secrecy of those programs. And that struck me as something, naively, it struck me as something rather extraordinary, because even as a journalist, up until that moment, I was quite confronted by the idea that you could out and out lie in government in order to pursue government interests. But under black world auspices, that's in exactly what you were allowed to do. So that kind of was like a red flag to a bull to me. I thought, well, if you can lie to protect a program, I want to know what that program is. Sure. So I spent a long time in the US. The thing about Jane's Defense Weekly, Jane's as a publishing organization, was it had fantastic access to the Pentagon, to companies all over the Western Hemisphere. Even latterly, towards the end of the 1980s, it opened up the Soviet Union's defense industrial base to people like me in the organization. So my eyes had been opened through investigating these classified programs. But at the time that article landed on my desk, as I say in the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, I very nearly threw it in the bin, because I looked at it and I thought, what is this nonsense? We had our post open centrally. So this article was literally just placed on my desk. But something about it caught my eye, and it was the things that you mentioned, which were the names of those companies. So companies like Bell, some like Convair, Martin, forerunner to Lockheed Martin, were all mentioned in this article. And that stopped me from throwing it in the bin. And what it said was, or what it alleged was, that these companies were studying the science of gravity and anti-gravity, and they were seriously pursuing it. Well, of course, in my world, anti-gravity was a sort of kind of corollary to the whole UFO question. It was simply an untouchable in my world, a massive taboo. So the piece was loaded with danger, as for me professionally, which was another reason I initially wanted to throw it in the trash. But as I say, those names in that first paragraph pulled it out for me. I read it. There were people who were quoted very seriously as studying all of this. It seemed to be sourced quite well. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna look at it, and I'll call a few people in the business to see if they know anything about it. And at that point, in the sort of tradition of cod thrillers, doors started to be slammed in my face. And that was the moment I thought there really is a story there, and which led me to pursue it.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I can see why you say it's an inflection point. It's almost like the timeline potentially splits there, and there's a Nick Cook that threw that article in the bin and went a completely different way with his life, and we're not even having this conversation in that timeline. That's crazy to think about. And The Hunt for Zero Points, that came out, we're talking early 2000s, 2001. Yep. And it did extremely well. You're essentially making the case inside the book that is the most credible version of nuts and bolts hypothesis, I think, ever put on paper. And the argument broadly is, and correct me if I get this wrong at all, Nick, you're the author, you're the artist, you're allowed to kind of, change it. That there was a real breakthrough in gravity control research that most likely came out of work by the Nazis around the Bell and the Wenceslaus mine that got hoovered up in Operation Paperclip. and has kind of been running in classified compartments ever since. Did you go on?
Well, I was going to say it was a slight variation on that, which was,
please.
I was aware that in order to pursue the very real story as it initially started to present itself to me, which was that under classified auspices, potentially in the US, the whole anti-gravity science had been pursued in deep secrecy. In order to confront that, I had to go back in time because the story had a tail to it. And the tail was the whole Nazi flying saucer mythology piece.
Sure.
Now, so to be exact, when I investigated that piece, I found some very strong mythological evidence that surfaced, including the bell. I think The Hunt for Zero Point was really the first book to really surface the whole myth and legend of the bell, which was this purportedly anti-gravity device that the Nazis had been developing obviously in deep secrecy and sort of in the latter stages of the war. I found no slam dunk evidence that the Nazis had been pursuing anti-gravity technology or flying saucer technology. Lots of circumstantial evidence and lots of very compelling data, particularly around things like Foo Fighters, which were a genuine phenomenon, that something was going on. But the real sort of takeaway from the whole Nazi period actually was, in a sense, even more fundamental. It was that the Americans took the classified architecture of there was a guy called Hans Kammler who was in charge of the Nazi secret SS development program. And of course, it was particularly unpleasant, wicked, and all the rest of it, because it hauled in the infrastructure of the Holocaust to slave labor to make it all happen. And but there was a structural component to the secrecy system that Kammler drew up for secret programs, which the Americans purloined or took back to America and instituted in their own black world system. So that, for me, was the real, genuine takeaway architecture from the Nazis. There was this peripheral piece, which was interesting, about whether or not they had developed, flying saucers and anti-gravity technology, which we can come on to. So, that, sorry to sort of belabor it, but there was a slight subtlety in what the book was saying around that.
No, I think that's really important, because a lot of this kind of Nazi lore gets mixed up. And like you say, it borders more on mythology than hard data. And there's some circumstantial stuff, but there's nothing direct. The Kammler kind of line is really interesting. So I'll just ask this directly. Do you think he did die at the end of the war, or do you think he was kind of seconded into these programs and kept, secret?
At the end of the book, I draw no conclusion. I mean, as you said, the book came out over 25 years ago. And at the end of it, I could draw no firm conclusion. There was, because there were 6 conflicting accounts of his death, it was pretty obvious to me and other people who'd looked at it that Kammler had, in some senses, been at the center of some conspiracy to enlist his services. The problem was I couldn't tell whether that was the West or the East, whether it was the Americans or the Russians. He could have gone either way. We now know, however, that he did not die at the end of the war. So that has emerged since the book's publication, particularly through some great work done by some colleagues of mine who published a book called The Hidden Nazis, which is about Hans Kammler. I worked with them for a little bit in the aftermath of The Hunt for Zero Point. We then went our sort of separate ways. And anyway, they published this remarkable book, which provides documentary evidence that Kammler survived the war. He surrendered himself to the Americans at the end of the war and was held in an interrogation camp in Europe, so in Germany itself, until 1946, when the trail runs cold again. So he was either released, escaped again, or got bumped off. Any one of those is entirely possible and plausible. I think, given his crimes against humanity and given what he was, which was an administrator, not a scientist, I strongly suspect that he got bumped off. He was just too dangerous. Once the Americans had milked him for information, I think they probably dispatched him in some form. So, but anyway, it is, as you say, Dan, it's a completely fascinating story. So, that was a foundational element of the Hunt for Zero Point as well.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And then at some point, this outlier came along, this experience that kind of shook you from that nuts and bolts place. When did you first notice that model kind of wobbling? Was this experience, the shared death experience, or did it kind of start before that?
Again, there was a bit of a not backstory to it, but there was another component to it, which I perhaps should go into, because it fills in sort of the missing years between when I left Jane's Defense Weekly and when that, again, that sort of inciting incident that led me to look at the consciousness component of the whole UAP phenomenon kicked in. So I left Jane's Defense Weekly in around 2005. I continued to do a bit of consulting for them after I sort of formally left. But the very last thing that I did in the organization was conceive of and write a series which I called Technology Audit, which was sort of crazily ambitious. It was to map the entire science and technology base of the 9 aerospace and defense prime contractors in the Western Hemisphere. So those prime contractors being companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and companies over here like BAE Systems, Thales, Saab, etc. So when I was some way into that exercise, about maybe 3 or 4 companies, 5 companies in, I realized that there was a really strong pattern there. The pattern being all of these companies do remarkably similar business. I mean, they look kind of almost identical. They do similar stuff. They all build, platforms, weapon systems. But running through them all, like words in a stick of rock, was what's called systems of systems integration. They knew how to put together huge systems architectures, like, for example, the Iron Dome system over Israel, for example, would be a massive systems of systems where a whole lot of interlocking components and sensors and architectures need to come together for the thing to work.
Yeah.
And so buried in that systems of systems knowledge was deep knowledge about this planet. So from subsea to interstellar space, these companies built spacecraft, subsea vehicles, submarines, you name it, aircraft, ships. So they knew about the environment. And what that then said to me was, but I also realized that they were only using a fraction of the knowledge that they had around these systems of systems to put into weapon systems and, ships, tanks, and aircraft. The rest of it was lying there dormant, and the rest of it, or a lot of it, could have gone into, quotes, saving the planet. So I'd worked on the series with a lot of those companies' chief technology officers. And in 2011, I brought them together in Washington, D.C. to a sort of summit. I think it was the first time they'd ever come together as a group, all of these rival companies at CTO level. And I asked them this. And we had also Barack Obama's science advisor, Dr. John Holdren, was there as well. So convening them all, I said to them, you've got extraordinary technology that actually looks as if it could save the planet. Could you actually do that? And they all went, yeah, we could save the planet. We've got the technology. And I went, great. Well, why don't we get on with it and do it? Or why don't you get on with it and do it? And they went, but there's a problem. And the problem is that our business model does not support it. We contract with governments, and a lot of the clean tech and sustainable technology developments that that go on in that sustainable development world are not in the government sphere. They're in the commercial sphere. So we can't do it. So I said, well, what if we tried to change your business model, vary your business model to allow you to do that? At that point, this was in a big conference in DC. I thought that there were lots of management consultants in the room. I thought they were going to stick their hands up and, bite the arms off of these CTOs to work with them on varying their business model. But actually they didn't, perhaps because they had more sense. So Muggins here sticks his hand up. I stick my hand up and go, well, why don't we work with you, my organization, why don't we work with you to try and vary your business model to get you into this? Which I did with various companies, most notably Lockheed Martin, at CTO level to try and get them to do all of this stuff. And it was all going actually really well until 2014 when ISIS pops up and Russia annexes Crimea. And at that point, things change almost overnight. And the message to me is, well, that was a lot of fun, but now we're going to go back to business as usual. And the business as usual element, of course, is weapons and
sure.
and platforms. So all of that felt like unfinished business to me. It was like, there are architectures which can seriously help the planet, transition out of, a lot of the great deal of the mess that we're in. But this was a problem of mindset. It was like, it wasn't really even the business model in the end. It was these very powerful people, these powerful organizations just didn't want to do it. They had the technology, but they did not want to do it. So I parked that. And that was in 2014. And it's funny how these things, or strange how these things work, because almost within weeks, the next chapter opened, the next window opened. And that was, as I've written about and talked about before, I was in the room when my much loved mother-in-law died. My wife, Ali, was holding her hand. And at the precise moment my mother-in-law died, her mum, Ali's mum died, Ali, my wife, stands up and tells the room, which, family, close family in the room, just tells us all that everything is absolutely fine. Everything is all right. She's all right. It's all good. And I'm looking at my wife of 25 years or whatever she was then. And I thought, no, it's not good. This is a really bad moment. Your mum has just died. When I talked to her about it afterwards, she said, weren't you there too? And I went, where? And she said, well, I was in this space that was infinitely connected and I knew everything. I tried to bring this information back with me, but I couldn't. But, and it was imbued with this sensation that I can only describe as, a sort of love born of this infinite connectivity.
Yeah.
I was aware of near-death experiences at that time, but I'd never heard of anything like this. But when I Googled it, I found out it was something called a shared death experience, which actually lots of people have had. Books have been written about it. I didn't know that. But that set me off on a whole new train of investigation, which was, I have to know what this thing was that my wife experienced, that it seems like a whole lot of people are experiencing because whole books have been written about this thing. And if whole books have been written about it, that's data. My world, coming out of Jane's, coming out of, working with these aerospace and defense companies to try and vary their business models to save the planet, was all about data. And the consciousness realm, for all of its many unknowns, was filled with data. And I thought, okay, that's good enough for me. I'm off. And that's how that particular chapter unfolded.
Wow. I got chills when you relayed the story about the shared death experience. Roz, our producer, had a similar experience when her stepdad passed away. So you guys, we'll touch on it a little later because it's a really interesting experience. And I can tell that you're fascinated. And that must have been crazy to go through because, it's very different going through something as an investigator versus a husband with a loved one, right?
Yeah, it was. And so, it really was. And I knew, obviously, that Ali wasn't making this up. And I particularly knew it when I read all of these other accounts, which almost overlaid, you could lay her account onto it almost word for word, and it would map. So, that just completely pulled me in. And I as I said, I had to go off and investigate it. And but it also, it signifies something else in a way, because I can honestly say that my wife is an experiencer. I am not an experiencer. I'm an observer. And we often, Ali and I, talk about the significance of that moment. I mean, beyond the fact that obviously it involved the death of her much loved mother, but the significance of it for me was that as a journalist, I was a reporter of events, and I was meant to be very objective. If I had experienced that myself, it would have pushed me over the threshold into someone or something that was not objective. Yeah. And, ever since, so I'm profoundly grateful that Ali had that experience, because I trust it and it got me into this field. But I'm able to stay, per my journalistic training and background, on the right side of reporting, because I'm not that experiencer. I'm a documenter. I'm an observer. I'm a reporter of these things. And I think that, to me, that's important still, because of the sanctity, as I see it, of that the requirement for someone like me to just stay outside of the margins of the story and report on it from outside, which is what I've always tried to do.
Yeah, it's you see it a lot in this subject, in the different parts where people who are journalists become kind of advocates, and it's a difficult thing to balance. And really, this part of your story, for me, when I'm kind of looking at it, there's a kind of dream logic to it as well. This is the part of your life where you'd been petitioning Robert Bigelow of BASS, who did the ORSAT program and took money from the government to investigate the paranormal. You've been petitioning him for years to get kind of inside his facilities, got nowhere. Then in 2020, he runs an essay competition for which the question is, what's the best available evidence for the survival of consciousness after permanent bodily death? You submit, you win the prize, or one of the prizes. There were several, if I remember correctly. You end up walking through those doors you've been trying to get in for years. And a couple of years later, you're research director for the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. That's a hell of a poetic synchronicity. Talk to me about that journey.
I mean, yes, because I almost have to pinch myself to recall that's exactly how it happened. Well, actually, not quite exactly, because there's a sort of just a bit leading up to that, which was after Ali had that shared death experience. I felt consumed, as I said, by the need to go and investigate the whole sort of consciousness thing. But I had a day job. I had things, I had books to write and, other things besides. So how to square that circle? Well, then a remarkable thing happened. I was funded by a philanthropist to carry out research into consciousness. He just said, here's a pot of money. I recognize this sort of need in you to go and do this research. So all you need to do is just come and tell me what you found out. There were no other strings attached to it. And I did that for about a year and a half of really concerted burying myself in the study of consciousness, and was able to, obviously put food on my family's table at the same time, which was obviously really important. And that coincided actually mostly with the COVID epidemic. So it was a time when I couldn't go out of the house anyway. It was a perfect time to do desktop research, find out about this subject, and I did. And then, as you said, 2020 comes along, and I'm thinking, well, I know all of this stuff now. What do I do with it? And within weeks of my thinking that, and this research period having come to an end, that's when Robert Bigelow initiates this competition to launch his Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. The exam question, which everyone has to answer, same exam question, is provide the best evidence for proof of the survival of consciousness after permanent bodily death. What happens to us after we die? And I thought, having done the research I'd done, I thought, I can answer that. I couldn't have answered it beforehand, but I can have a go at answering that question now. And as you said, I did. There were 29 winners. I got a prize, which necessitated my going to Las Vegas to pick it up from Robert Bigelow in that facility that I'd always stared at longingly over the fence, thinking, how am I ever going to get in there? And then afterwards, as you said, Robert Bigelow offered me and a bunch of other people positions as research directors of this new Consciousness Institute. So, yeah, I mean, I couldn't have engineered that if I'd tried. But yet somehow, and this is where, I'm in danger of sounding a little bit mystical, that somehow some force, let's call it the universe, sort of clicked into gear and just brought it about in a way that I couldn't possibly have done myself.
That's so interesting. And it's so interesting that it kind of started in COVID for you, a period where a lot of us are locked indoors, looking inward. And certainly for me, this whole UFO journey and consciousness journey took a step up during that time, whether it had something to do with us just having the time to do nothing but what our heart desires, or whether, it was a function of the world looking inward en masse in that moment is really interesting. And that led you to Ladbroke Hall this year, where you gathered more than 200 people in London for the launch of the Exo Institute. And you've described it as essentially the action component of everything you've been writing in things like The Light Beyond the Mountains and the Outlier series, two series I'd highly recommend on your Substack that we'll get into in a little bit. So the first question is I guess, a simple one. Why launch it now?
Well, yeah, that's a great question because I have three colleagues and in the Exo Institute, Sean Sutherland, James Herself, and Pippa Malmgren. And we talked for a while about launching it. And, we all had day jobs. And so it was difficult to sort of, herd us all together to make it happen. And I think a number of things, I mean, the sort of the background to my desire to launch something like the Exo Institute was born of that unfinished business, as I described it with those aerospace and defense companies, back in 2014, where I could see that there are bodies, organizations, institutions that have the capacity to really move the dial on global challenges like, climate change, hunger, poverty, all of these things. It's just this mindset, as I said earlier, that stopped them from doing it. And so that led me to thinking, after I'd done the Bigelow stuff, how can you change mindsets? How can you, and if mindset is related to consciousness, is there something that is within consciousness that can bring about a sort of a change in mindset that will make people want to engage in those global challenges, amongst which are irony coming out of the profession that I had, which was reporting on the aerospace and defense sector in particular, one of which was, what can we do about ending conflict, or at least trying to, removing the threat of annihilation, sure, from all of our lives. So it struck me that there were two things that could come together here, one of which was the consciousness dimension, which I had already become extremely interested in and done a lot of research on. And the second was this: how do we tackle global challenges in a way that's different from any way they've been tackled before? And so it seemed like those two things needed to come together. And in the Exo Institute, they have. The Exo Institute is about looking at the emerging science of consciousness and reality with a view to communicating the paradigm change that is coming. I mean, I think we can talk about this, but I think there's little doubt now that we are approaching, or a paradigm change in science is rapidly converging on us. We only have to look at the whole UAP subject that's being openly discussed on Capitol Hill, in the Senate and in Congress, to know that is true. And so, the whole idea of the Exo Institute is to communicate this paradigm change, this new science that is coming, which we think bespeaks a new Copernican revolution. The last the original Copernican revolution being sort of 400 or 500 years ago, which triggered all of the breakthroughs in science from, the Age of Enlightenment, Newton, Descartes, all of that stuff, unfortunately led to the splitting of science and spirit, science and the church. And in some ways led to the very divided world that we have now. So the Exo Institute is about communicating this new science to sectors that can make a difference: business, finance, tech, government and policy, and signaling the science and some of the more arcane language of consciousness and the anomalies around consciousness, UAP, near-death experiences, telepathy, all of that stuff. Signaling that in clear language that is not scary to organizations and people who have had no exposure to this whatsoever, or if they have had exposure to it, it just sounds woo, crazy, and
sure,
and irrelevant, frankly. So that's what we're there for. We're very excited by it. We decided to launch it in part because of the way we saw things going suddenly. It's like Donald Trump, love him or hate him, has acted as this sort of catalyst for change. And without that's fine. But what it's also doing is destabilizing things enormously. We only have to look into the world to see what that destabilization looks like. And as the world destabilizes, I think so people are awakening to this other side, this consciousness side, and those two things I think are not unrelated. As I write in the Outlier series, I think the more you squeeze the hard world of material reality, the three-dimensional world that we live in, the more consciousness seems to expand to awaken us to new possibilities, the real possibilities, that the existence that we see, my desk, the tree outside my window, all of that is a very narrow sliver of existence, and that there is a much deeper, as an infinitely deep reality scope that we have not really begun to even explore. But it's that reality scope, that emerging science, that is going to be, the fundamentals, the basis of the flip that science is about to go through. But without preparation, those sectors, business, finance, tech, government, and policy, are going to be woefully ill prepared for what's going to happen, and the ontological shock is going to be profound. So we want to have dialogue with those sectors in order to catalyze things, but in order to do it as well in a sort of regulated way that allows them to understand the sort of that this is not arcane or irrelevant. It is very real. It's rooted in a science we don't understand, and we can talk about whether or not, sections in the deeply buried, classified realm of, the United States, China, and Russia do understand it. But I am pretty reliably persuaded they don't. I mean, how could they? We're talking about a science that is infinite. We're only going to begin to scratch the surface of that. So, sorry, long-winded answer.
Please don't apologize. This is fascinating.
But that is the basis of the rationale for us wanting to launch the Exo Institute, and to do it now, because the world can't wait. This is happening now, and we need to, we always sort of semi-jokingly say that the Exo Institute has this kind of midwife role, this midwifery role of helping to, fortunately we are assisted very ably by a plethora of other organizations that are working in the same space. But, this is our contribution to this revolution, which is happening. We are helping, we hope, to birth this new science into existence.
That is fascinating. And I hear what you're saying about that Copernican revolution. I understand that at some point someone had to say, hey, let's measure the things we can measure, and we'll get to that down the line, the kind of metaphysical stuff. But we kind of lost ourselves at some point, and now we're almost, as the internet is emerging as this kind of collective consciousness, we're almost trying to build something else. Like you say, there's opportunity in the destabilization. And that usually comes with something that you call the Finch moment, which is just essentially, the black swan, the outlier data, something that we should be looking at with curiosity. And there was someone that spoke at the event that I thought was fascinating when I saw his name there. A lot of the people I would, they've spoken in the UAP subject before, but this person, Dr. Lee Berger, I had a fascinating conversation with him when I bumped into him at a small London pub a few years ago. I got, very nerdly excited. My wife was like, "Why are you excited?" And I was like, "Oh, this paleoanthropologist just walked in the pub." And she was just like, "You're such a nerd. No one else would, react like this." But yeah, so Lee Berger, he's a paleoanthropologist, digs in caves, and he found essentially a human precursor called Homo naledi. It was a small-brained hominin in what he calls the Rising Star cave system in South Africa that, on available evidence, appears to have been deliberately burying its dead, carving symbolic engravings, using fire deep inside the cave system, way before we think that humans were doing it. And we kind of have this myth where we think big brain means more complexity, and here comes this human precursor with a smaller brain than us that is doing all of these things that we think make us kind of different. And in a way, that always kind of struck me as maybe a first contact moment. We were never alone. We just kind of integrated with everything we weren't alone with. Why was Berger essential for you with the Exo Institute?
Well, you're right. Lee is a remarkable mind, and a phenomenally brave explorer too. Because implicit in everything that you said is that a lot of what he's done pioneeringly has tilted against the sort of received wisdom from academia, and he's really stuck his neck out to demonstrate exactly what you said, that before us and separate to us existed on this planet a non-human intelligence, which it wasn't human. That Homo naledi was not human, but exhibited many of the traits that we would characterize as human. The things that you outlined there, Dan, including burying dead, inscribing things on walls, the use of fire, a sort of the beginnings of societal organization. And so having Lee there was really important. And actually, I can't claim any credit for it. My colleague, James Hersoff, knows Lee very well. And he asked for Lee to come and speak, which he generously did at our launch event. But the importance of having him there for me was that this was an anomaly. What Lee had discovered was an anomaly. And, whatever mainstream academia said, it is now, becoming ever more patently true that this non-human intelligence existed on the planet, before and alongside us. And that, as I said in my introductory speech, and pulling up those finches, the finches were a reference to Darwin's finches on the island of Galapagos, which, along with a bunch of other birds, signals to him when he returned back to Britain, and his analysis thereof, that these anomalies actually, bespoke a variation in the existing pattern, the creation pattern of existence that was supposed to signify how the world or evolution had worked, or species had developed up to that point, and led him, of course, to his theory of evolution. So my point about the finches was there are anomalies all over science which traditionally get poo-pooed and sidelined by academia. The point being, those very anomalies are the clues that give us, that provide us with breakthrough knowledge to what is emerging, a new paradigm. Therefore, far from doing what academia seems very prone to do a lot of the time, which is dismiss those anomalies, they are the very thing that we should be analyzing, because they provide the clues to the new breakthroughs. And so that really was my point. And Lee was able to demonstrate that very ably at the launch of the Institute a month ago.
That's amazing. And I guess really the overarching kind of idea in Lee's work is that, we've defined consciousness and intelligence and life too narrowly. And this is almost a through line for a lot of your speakers and a lot of your members. David, I might mess some of these names up, so feel free to correct me on these. But David Aritsoy, you knew, there you go. From Imperial, he brings the hard kind of neuroscience of psychedelic assisted therapy. We have Jude Currivan, widening the frame to cosmology and the participatory universe. Aya Whiteley on what real expertise looks like in extreme performance environments. Hakeem Isla on psi as neglected human capacity rather than superpower. And then Eric Hahn and Philip Luetman. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Luetman, there you go. Thank you. coming from inside banking and Deloitte, these are a really interesting set of kind of Avengers you've assembled here. And, there's even Eric talks about AI and how we're building in our blindness to AI. And that's going to affect, the next decade of how we're approaching things and how it kind of leads us. So how did you choose these people to bring them together? And what do you think they can do together that they can't do alone?
So the evening was divided into two parts. The first half was those speakers, Lee Berger, Jude Currivan, and Ia Whiteley. Ia is remarkable. She has worked with the European Space Agency to effectively train astronauts for the unexpected in space. So Jude also has developed some remarkable thinking around consciousness and the cosmology, the connectedness of the universe. They spoke in the first half along with me, and we were talking about these respective anomalies, these anomalies in their careers, which brought together actually begin to speak to a new model of understanding of reality. The second half was about really questioning what that means, what that means to each and every one of us. If, as Hakeem Eisler, a former US Army special operative, now trained in psychic phenomena and research, and in actually practicing psi phenomena himself, whether that's telepathy or psychokinesis, moving objects with your mind. If each and every one of us, as he and other consciousness researchers claim, and which I think is can be shown to be true, that these are not special powers that a small section of the community out there has. We all have these powers in us latently. I knew Ingo Swann, who was, the CIA's first remote viewer, and he was at pains to say that those his skills, his gifts were not unique to him, that we all have them. It's just that most of us choose to push them to one side and ignore them. And then we had, so that was sort of Hakeem talking about that part. Then we had Philip Luttman and Eric Hahn. Philip comes from Deloitte, as you said, and Eric Hahn actually comes from a huge investment bank. He's from Morgan Stanley in New York. He was talking in a personal capacity, but why I wanted Philip, why I was so grateful that Philip and Eric came and spoke as well, is because they were deeply representational of the communities that we're trying to reach. Those, the business, the tech, and the finance communities who need to understand that this is not, a bunch of cranks and tinfoil hat people exploring this stuff. These anomalies are now being explored deeply by serious institutions who recognize that it would be stupid to find yourself on the wrong side of the fence when all of this happens, and that willful ignorance of this science and this subject is going to serve no one's purpose, least of all their own, because they're going to be so deeply surprised and shocked by it when it emerges that they're not going to be any good to anyone. So that communication, the communication that this is being discussed and looked at and analyzed within very, quotes, real world institutions, for me sent a very powerful signal that we can't ignore this any longer. Sectors, business sectors, government sectors cannot ignore this any longer. We have to prepare for it, and we need to be doing that now. And so between them all, or rather amongst them all, they laid this out. For when we choreographed at Exo, we choreographed this as a kind of story to try and give it a kind of beginning, middle, and end sense. But I thought the end that was delivered by that panel session was extraordinarily powerful, because it said, actually, this is going to affect each and every one of us, when it breaks, because we are not, contrary to what our five senses tell us, we're not separated from our environment. We are completely plugged into it. This material body of ours is sort of like an avatar, and beneath it, we are all playing we are joined together in a highly complicated, almost simulated computational environment that is interlinked and hyper-connected. But we don't feel it that way yet. But we will. It's coming.
That is fascinating. I wish I could have been there on the evening. I could talk for hours and hours and hours to every single person you mentioned there. And I love what you said about them not being special powers as well. People have these moments of intuition where, they'll know who's at the door or who's ringing on the phone and stuff like that before the phone calls. These are all, to me, little signs of these outliers. And, personally, I've been using a Muse headset to kind of train myself to be able to raise different brain waves and things like that. And even that sounds like woo, but there's hard data. I can show you graphs that I've recorded whilst I'm doing it. And it just kind of says that there's this new world awaiting us. And it reminds me of the kind of almost iPhone and BlackBerry moment. The world had BlackBerries. We thought that was the be all and end all of mobile phones. And then along comes Apple with their touchscreen device, and BlackBerry don't even exist anymore. That's essentially what we're saying, is the world we have now will be completely transformed. And a lot of this plugs into, in physics, we have two theories that work really well inside their own domains. We've got relativity that describes the very large with really extraordinary precision. And we use this every day. It's letting us talk right now. And then we have also quantum mechanics that describes the very small, that also plugs into letting us talk. But never the two shall meet. We haven't kind of built the bridge between those two things yet. I guess, they don't talk to each other, and they both predict reality, both mutually incompatible. And the nuts and bolts and the UAP frame and the consciousness stuff almost feel like that to me. Two descriptions that produce real predictions that we use every day, but kind of refuse to talk to each other. Valet touched on that, UFOs as physical and psychic. People like Jung have too. Does that kind of parallel land for you? And what could be the missing key to combining those things?
Oh, it completely parallel lands for me. I was blown away when I went to see. Well, I heard Jacques Vallée and Hal Puthoff and a bunch of other people talking on stage at an event that I was invited to in New York in 2017, which was the 5th Philip K. Dick Film Festival, at which they were honoring Ingo Swann.
That's cool.
Ingo sort of having been a sort of inspiration in many ways to Philip K. Dick's writings. And on stage, Jacques Vallée began to talk about this, the UFOs as being physical and non-physical, psychic, as Jung had. And not knowing very much about it at that point, it teased me. I thought, how can that be? How can something be both physical and non-physical? But of course, over time, and as I've launched myself into the whole consciousness field and the anomaly field, it becomes increasingly clear that if reality is a construct, and if general relativity and Einstein's space-time model is just a framework for how we perceive our three-dimensional reality, then what we are effectively confronted by is an interface that allows us to experience just enough reality to navigate this material world. That's the remarkable insight that Professor Donald Hoffman has brought through his interface theory of reality. Then, of course it begins to make sense that we shouldn't look on UFOs as purely physical objects, because in fact, nothing in our reality is purely physical. It is all made up of this, this sort of whimsical stuff that is both physical and non-physical, because that is the construct that general relativity and quantum mechanics have given us to enable us to navigate our reality. It doesn't, whatever's coming next doesn't negate those. It simply folds them into, both general relativity and quantum mechanics. It folds them into the new model. And, but a lot of other things are going to have to get folded into that as well. For example, the spirituality component that got binned out of science when we had the Enlightenment split between the church and science, 250, 300 years ago. That will have to be folded back in, because science on its own, in the strict definition of it now, does not explain our reality model or the reality model that is the real reality model. So yeah, it's as I said earlier, we are on the cusp of this new Copernican revolution, which, for all of its instability, I think is going to offer extraordinary opportunity. And again, if we go back to the original Copernican revolution, triggered initially 450, 500 years ago, that led to a very, slow burn in terms of, revealing science like, Newton's gravitational theories. And then, of course, the industrial and engineering revolutions that came on the back of that, the Industrial Revolution and so forth. That happened over hundreds of years. We are faced with such an existential crisis on this planet now, through our own fault predominantly, that we cannot wait, hundreds of years for a new Copernican revolution to come along. We can't even wait decades. We've got to bring this stuff in now, because it is going to trigger an explosion of science and new engineering and new technology, which we need.
Yeah, absolutely. It essentially, to give a practical example, I guess, it's kind of like Neo at the end of the Matrix seeing the code versus seeing the corridor and the doors and the people in front of him. It's info versus the reality we see. And inside the Outlier series, you've been developing what you kind of tentatively call the adaptive interface model. And the idea, as I understand it, is that certain anomalous phenomena are external incursions into reality, the moments where the underlying informational layer becomes partially visible. So where wondrous machines and phenomena may secrete into being, things like UFOs, psi, NDEs are kind of different ways the same architecture reveals itself at these kind of enormously pressured thresholds. And I guess the disturbing version of that for me is that reality may push the impossible into the system, specifically when the system is becoming brittle, like data injections at civilizational stress points. So take me into that model. What's the engine, and how literally are you offering that?
Well, I was first drawn to explore it when, we can all pick up on certain patterns that UFOs, UAP, seem to suggest. So one of the clearer ones for me, particularly having come out of the whole, aerospace and defense infrastructure or reporting on it, was trope that, well, no, not trope, the evidence that UAP are drawn to nuclear installations. Yeah, that is demonstrably true and has been ever since nuclear systems have, been on the planet for 80 odd years. So on one level, it looks like a slam dunk. This is an extraterrestrial, or these are extraterrestrial civilizations who are disturbed by the development of nuclear weapons by, crazy earthlings who are not responsible enough to develop them responsibly. And we need to reconnoiter these weapons and know where they are, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And that's quite persuasive on one level. And on that same level, I wouldn't argue with that. That's what the evidence seems to suggest. But then I thought, well, actually, there's potentially another way of looking at it, which is UAP, it is said, are drawn to highly entropic, or rather, I should say, anomalous phenomena is drawn to highly entropic states. So you get, of which nuclear systems are an example. High entropy is, paraphrasing, the highly chaotic systems that
Sure.
are veer from coherence into chaos. And at the other end, we have, on the other side, we have coherence, where everything is coheres nicely into a sort of stable pattern. And between those two, we have a threshold. Nuclear systems, I would argue, are threshold dynamics. A split-second wrong call or an emerging crisis can trigger the whole nuclear response. That is a threshold system. And so maybe we should be looking at the threshold system as the thing that the UAP is drawn to. That's my initial thinking. And we have sort of mirrors of that, in a sense, in paranormal phenomena. So take the example of my wife's experience, shared death experience with her mum. My mother-in-law was on the threshold between life and death. And on that threshold, exactly on that threshold, my wife has a shared death experience in which she is introduced to an alternate reality, another realm, a sense of something much deeper out there. So if there is a pattern in that, maybe we should be looking at the deeper pattern rather than the obvious one, which is UAP are drawn to nuclear weapon systems because they represent a threat. Long story short, that led me into looking into the deep substrate of the universe as an informationally based system. And if there is an informational layer, as physicists increasingly posit there is, to beneath the physical reality that we occupy, then maybe this is what we're seeing in terms of anomalies, whether they're UAPs or ghosts or shared death or near-death experiences, are responses to some, as you said, sort of overpressure in the system that needs to trigger some kind of response from the substrate, the informational substrate. In effect, a kind of automatic, if you like, healing system of the universe itself to try to get the system stable again. So you could argue, if you apply that to the present day world, with all of its turmoil, that we are experiencing increasing levels of, for example, UAP, UFO sightings at this time. Are they all coming to check us out from, different star systems because let's have a look at the crazy humans who are about to go and blow themselves up? Or, their planet is about to collapse into catastrophic climate change? It seems less likely that they're doing that than this is some sort of triggered response by the underlying substrate of the universe itself, which just happens to manifest in a form that looks like a UAP or a UFO. Because I'm pretty sure the data says that we ourselves, our consciousness, is part of the overall mind of the whole universe itself, that we are in some sense responsible for these responses, and that our consciousness helps to shape what we see. So, thanks to the great work of Jacques Vallée, who demonstrated that, 200 years ago, where people are seeing UFOs today, back then they would be seeing angels or fairies or, some other manifestation of the paranormal. So that is what the adaptive interface model says. It says that our universe, which is computational and informational in its raw nature, is conditioned to respond, to repair itself when when entropy increases to such an extent that it threatens the coherence or the architecture of the system through too much instability. And these things appear and lead to greater coherence. They lead to greater coherence because we stop and ponder what the anomaly is. We give great thought, because we are a curious species by and large, to what the anomaly is, and the system lets our consciousness go to work on the problem and restore a kind of layer of stability back into the system where previously it had been pushed into chaos.
That is fascinating. So kind of consciousness as a band-aid. And the way we're talking about thresholds as well, the first nuclear test is a threshold. If you go back and, you watch Christopher Nolan's movie about Oppenheimer, that was his whole worry, that we were stepping over a threshold into a new world. Trauma as well are these threshold places. And there are so many kind of anomalous experiences that come about in moments of trauma. Chris Bledsoe famously was going through a massive negative change in his life when he had his encounter. And it also kind of reminds me that, we lack words for a lot of things here. The subtleties. We hear people say, you can manifest in this universe what you want. And essentially that's what we're talking about here, but it's a mechanism. And like you say, it's not superpower, it's not magic. It's literally, if I want to be a rock star, I've got to pick up a guitar first, and then I can kind of cause that threshold to come about. But talking of words, this idea fascinates me on another level because it removes this kind of moral language from UAP discourse. We're not talking about, are they friendly or hostile? We're saying essentially this is diagnostic.
So yes, there is a diagnostic element well, it is all about diagnostics, I think, in how paranormal phenomena present themselves into our reality space, which, of course, on one level, you could say, well, that's a bit depressing because we are effectively, sort of avatars within this simulated game that we appear to occupy, if this theory holds, which, makes us on one level rather insignificant. But actually, I think quite the reverse, because I think whilst the system itself is really primarily only interested in data, particularly highly creative data, of which I think we humans are very good at generating. Whilst it is predominantly interested in data, it doesn't care whether that data is, quotes, good or evil. That is a distinction that we put on it. Having said that, we as humans bring values into the system which it's in themselves would be highly sought after by the system itself. The way we make moral judgments, the way draw up ethics, I think would be of great value to the system itself. And for the system, you can, if you like, substitute the word God or a creator, because this is not I'm characterizing it as a computationally driven system. But of course, what it is a creation. Something has created this. So I do believe that our values, the values that we as humans bring into this model, would be highly sought after, and which brings a responsibility back on us to behave responsibly. Not to let the system drift into chaos, not to leave the fate of this world to out of control autocrats who don't always behave responsibly. So it is a very consequential time, I think, that we are in, because I think the system is presenting us with a sort of bifurcation. If we go down this road, we can destroy ourselves. But if we go down this road, we can come up with a highly creative alternative to that destruction model, which might just be, a whole new order of existence in which we humans have helped to, obviously we've helped to bring about. That in itself would be highly sought after data that plows back into the system, helping it to understand itself, grow and evolve. And that's the era we live in. I mean, it is quite scary to be living in this time, with its threat of mass destruction upon us. But actually, viewed the way I see it, it is a tremendously exciting time to be alive. And what a privilege it is to be alive at this time, because we have the capacity to shape the destiny of ourselves, the planet, and to an extent of the universe itself, because we are plowing this extraordinarily creative data back into the system so that it can evolve and move on, hopefully to a better state than it was in before or is in now.
That's incredible. I really love this theory, and it just sings to me on an intuitive level after everything I've read. And I even wonder if these kind of bifurcations build up, they became more numerous as more information is in the system. And so you need a bigger canvas for the artist to paint on. And I even wonder if that's tied maybe to the ever increasing speed of the expansion of the universe as we know it. That might be something ahead of us. It's fascinating to think about. Current disclosure with Donald Trump and these UFO files coming out. You've made the point that the risk isn't that there won't be disclosure, it's that there'll be the wrong kind. Do you think we're on the path for the right or the wrong kind here?
Well, of course, implicit in the adaptive interface model is that when we look at the UAP phenomenon, we may not be dealing with a threat at all. We just may be dealing with a symptom of the universe that is manifesting in the appearance or the form of UFOs or UAP at this time. Now, I'm not saying that that's exclusively what UAP are. There could be intelligences. I mean, clearly non-human intelligences, under the law exist, and there may be an infinite variety of them. They themselves may have hacked into this model, this system of ours from outside of it, or they could be a part of it within the model alongside us. But to look on UAP, UFOs as exclusively as a threat, I think is a mistake. We need to, as I say, we need to broaden that out. So, what I would like to see emerge in disclosure is a responsible debate around that This should not be characterized as an us versus them situation. This should not be characterized, by defense ministries as justification for increased levels of defense expenditure because we're faced with some kind of existential threat. We need a whole of academia approach to studying what this phenomenon teaches us about the reality that they and we occupy. Because, as we've said consistently in this whole discussion, what we experience, what we see in everyday reality is just a smidge of the deeper reality. We have got to understand or start making a serious effort across all of science, across all sectors, to seek to understand that, to look on this not as a period of deep ontological shock. I mean, shock will come, but as we said before, as an opportunity, that this is a whole new era of opportunity that awaits us if we confront it and deal with it responsibly, rather than in some terrible knee-jerk fashion, which on one level is what could happen, but actually the way I see disclosure happening at the moment, particularly with the recent release of these files, is a good thing. I mean, I've seen people say, across the internet that, it's very disappointing. They could have released so much more. Well, actually, maybe that's the strategy. It's like if you shake up a Coke bottle and then you release the lid all in one go, you're going to get an explosion. But if you gently release the pressure on that bottle top, then slowly it will equalize, and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe this is a deliberate strategy, that by gently introducing these files, these hitherto classified files about what UFOs are, as we saw with the first release, and if others follow it, then maybe in time we will just simply slowly become acclimatized to the idea that there are non-human intelligences out there, that they are a part of our reality. We may not see them every day, we may never see them, but they're here. And maybe that is the intention of Trump and his administration all along, is to acclimatize us slowly to the idea that we are not alone, and to lessen that ontological shock.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about your life, your experience of your wife, your mother-in-law, everything we've spoken about now, what do you think it means to be human?
Well, a tremendous privilege. I mean, that sounds trite for a start. I mean, it sounds, I think we are an extraordinary species. And, again, I'm going back to my, encounters with Ingo Swann, some 15, 20 years ago, when he was talking about these skills, powers, traits that we have, which are our true nature. We are filled with potential. We construct these shells of separation around us. Those have been constructed around us by the reality that we have helped co-create. And when we discover the true nature of our potential, which we are beginning to glimpse through all of these anomalies, through, all kinds of new data that's coming through, then I think we will be staggered, even more staggered by our creativity, by all the other things that make us human: compassion, empathy, love. all of these things combine in us to make us a remarkable species. And as I said before, we are alive here and now in a remarkable and consequential time when I think we're going to have to bring all of those good qualities about us to the fore to navigate ourselves through this period of choppy turbulence, which hopefully will be brief and hopefully will result in clear, and calm and clear, calm waters ahead.
Dear audience, please go and devour Nick's work. It's some of the very best in the subject. It's original, refreshing, cohesive, thought-provoking, and deeply moving. Read Hunt for 0 Point for the history. Read The Light Beyond the Mountains and the Outlier series on Nick's Substack if you want to thoughtfully consider how to bridge the gap between the nuts and bolts and the woo. And keep an eye on the Exo Institute, because if Nick's right, and I think he is, the next paradigm shift won't arrive on its own timetable. It's going to be midwifed into existence by people who are willing to take the Outliers seriously. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick. It's been such a pleasure, and I'd love to do this again sometime.
Thank you, Dan, and I'd love to do it again. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Spotify or on your chosen platform. If you could like, share, or subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. It helps us find our tribe. If you'd like to support the show and get access to a 1-hour live chat each month and early ad-free access, you can find us at Patreon. Just follow the link in the show notes or at our website, tobehumanshow.com. And feel free to reach out via the contact page or email at hello@tobehumanshow.com. As always, remember to be curious. The universe is bigger than we know.
What It Means to Be Human is a double-barrel production. This week's episode was produced by Roz Mugford and Dan Zetterstrom. Sound post-production by Parker Mosley with technical support from Dale Mugford. Our theme music is by Thunderbird.